she's sitting in a parking lot in Walgreens trying to figure out how to pick a lawyer when she realized that she needed a lawyer. There was nothing sophisticated or strategic in how she was trying to get this to the public domain.
And I think when you think about kind of some of the things that Nora laid out there, those kind of really interesting clues of where Rachel Mitchell might be going with this, you have to think about this process, too. Obviously, Republicans did not want to repeat what happened in 1991, where they were seen as grilling Anita Hill. So this is how this kind of all came about. So they were going to have this seasoned prosecutor from outside of Washington, D.C. ask the questions. And you know, I think just based on some of the sources that I've been hearing from, if you're a Republican senator, you're not so unhappy with how this is going right now because despite Lindsey Graham jumping in a couple times, they're not sitting there asking the question. So maybe this isn't working out all that bad for the Republican senators on the committee or Ford herself, this looks very fair to the American people. But the question is, it's not really a cross-examination that you would expect. So what does this mean for Brett Kavanaugh?
Yeah.
Who's going to put all these dots together? When is all of this going to... When will a senator say, oh, well, we've got this about the map, we've got this about loud music that was upstairs, but it was very quiet downstairs, so why would your girlfriend not think it was weird that she heard loud music and you ran up? You know, who will put those dots together? And we don't know that.
Okay, Jan, I understand that Ed O'Keefe has Senator Klobuchar with him, who will join us now. Ed, hello.
This woman is having to tell her story to America, and she is doing an extraordinary job in recalling what she can, in standing up to the questions from a professional prosecutor, and I am just proud of how she's doing.
Can you speak to the emotion in the room? I think you had a tear coming down your face at one point.
Well, for me, it's just the memory of so many women that have come forward in my old job, and I saw women like her come forward, and it's not always easy at all. And she clearly was trying to keep it confidential. She struggled with what to do, and when the reporter showed up at her doorstep, she finally decided that she couldn't keep silent, and she came forward.
Is there anything you've heard so far this morning that potentially changes what you guys want to ask of Judge Kavanaugh later today?
I don't think so. I mean, she has been very solid. I think time and time again, as most of America must be, we're frustrated that we don't have that FBI background check reopened. She said she could better recall the time period if she knew when Mark Judge worked at the Safeway, and he's hiding out at a beach house in Delaware, and she's simply trying to get that information. And the FBI could open that up at either the request of the president or the Republican senators asking the president to open it up. That hasn't happened. And I thought the other interesting thing was that there appeared to be some initial objection to even putting the polygraph test in, when that is used all the time by the Defense Department, by the FBI, by the CIA for job interviews. And this is a job interview for the highest court in the land, and we're simply trying to put in some records that show her truthfulness.
What was the point of those maps, do you think, that Mitchell?
I don't know. I guess we will have to find out, but she answered that question honestly.
What do you think that Rachel Mitchell is driving at?
As a survivor of sexual assault, what does this mean for the overall movement? What does this mean for other victims of sexual assault when she testifies like this?
As I said, for so long, these kinds of cases have been just swept under the rug. And things that happened in a house were not allowed to be in a courthouse. Well, that's different today. They are in the courthouse of America, and they will make a decision. They will help, I hope, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle to make a decision about who's going to serve in the highest courthouse of the land. One last thing.
All right. And there you have Senator Amy Klobuchar, former prosecutor herself, also is a graduate of Yale University, undergraduate, University of Chicago Law School, talking about what she saw. She put into the record the results of that polygraph test. But as you see here, each side is dug in on us, and it's not clear that anyone there on that Judiciary Committee has changed their view, and that's, quite frankly, not really who it's directed to. It's really to some of these moderate senators who will decide Judge Kavanaugh's vote. A couple of pieces of information. We are told at the White House they have been watching all of this, including the President of the United States has been watching this testimony by Dr. Ford. We are also told that Judge Kavanaugh has watched her testimony. He has just recently left his home up in Maryland to head down here to Capitol Hill for his part of the testimony, where he will have to answer that question about his own character, about his own credibility. As Dr. Ford has said, she is 100% sure that it was Brett Kavanaugh who sexually assaulted her more than 36 years ago. Nancy Cordes and I have been sitting hip to hip watching these hearings and everything that has happened so far. What has stood out to you?
Well, I think what's interesting is that Rachel Mitchell, the prosecutor who is working on behalf of the Senate Judiciary Republicans, is clearly trying to poke holes gently in Christine Blasey Ford's credibility. So asking her, for example, after Blasey Ford said that one of the lasting impacts of this trauma is that she has a fear of enclosed spaces. She wanted 2 front doors to her house, which is not aesthetically pleasing from the street.
That she doesn't like to fly.
That she doesn't like to fly. And so then you heard the prosecutor say, well, why is it then that you have traveled to the South Pacific and Costa Rica and Hawaii to surf? And what Blasey Ford said was that it's a lot easier for me to fly on vacation than it is to come back here to the East Coast. I only do it once a year. But it is an approach like that, respectful, not confrontational. This is not 12 Angry Men, but still trying to find holes in her story and in her credibility.
So then here's the question from a political standpoint, which is that while Rachel the special prosecutor, has perhaps helped the Republicans on there because she has done very careful, pointed questions in a serious and professional way. Has it benefited Judge Kavanaugh? Has it benefited those who are in the Kavanaugh camp, those in the White House, specifically the President of the United States, who believe that they have not been tough enough pushing back on this particular witness account?
I think she is able to look for those credibility gaps in a more sustained way than a bunch of Republican senators all coming loaded for bear would be able to, because she is going methodically through Blasey Ford's background, through her story. Well, you didn't originally want to hire a lawyer. Why did you decide to hire a lawyer? But in a lot of these cases, Ford has some pretty believable answers. Well, at first, I'd never been in a situation like this. I didn't think I needed a lawyer. I didn't know why. But then all my friends on the beach started saying, you should get a lawyer. Why did you get a polygraph? Well, because I was told that would be a good idea.
Which, from a 51-year-old mother of 2, she answers those questions like, well, my friends told me it might be a good idea. She has reasonable explanations
so far, yes,
one might say, to these sorts of answers.
Yes, but if you're a Republican and you're looking politically for a reason to say, no, even after all of this, even though she gave very credible answers, I still believe Judge Kavanaugh, they're looking to Mitchell to find those examples where her story might not line up. Why doesn't she know how she got 6 or 8 miles home that night? And that may be enough for them politically to say, I still believe Kavanaugh.
This is what we've learned this morning, is that this allegation against Judge Kavanaugh has come from a very credible woman. And in the words of Senator Feinstein, she said this morning, this is a job interview for Judge Kavanaugh. And the stakes, I think, are even higher now for the testimony that he gives coming up after they finish with Dr. Ford. What is he going to say to answer the questions about whether he was involved in what has been described as a very serious assault?
Well, it's a really difficult task, because all he really can say is, I wasn't there. You know, how many different ways can you say, I wasn't there, I've never done this? The people who know me best say that I've never done anything like this. When you're grilled for 2 hours, you know, with those kinds of questions, it's difficult to find a new way to say it.
Yeah, I know, Jeff, you guys are talking about it there, Jeff, John, Gail, and Jan.
Well, I think what the point Nancy was making is quite right. We've just seen Dr. Ford give details, be very specific about a whole set of memories. Brett Kavanaugh, when he comes forward, is just, he can't be detailed about a thing he says doesn't happen, and therefore his testimony, his period before questioning, will be just so very much different.
He's also said, though, I believe that something happened to her. I'm just saying it was not me. He's been very, very clear about that. He's not disputing that something happened to her. He's just saying, I was not the person.
And if his answer is, it wasn't me, that gives the Democratic senators a lot of time to ask him about a lot of other things. Like, well, what were you doing? How much did you drink in high school? What kind of, so going to all these details about his personal life that I expect you're going to see this afternoon.
Dr. Ford has not been on trial this morning, but Judge Kavanaugh will be on trial this afternoon. They are going to grill him exactly about what you just talked about, not only about his sexual history, what he has said in the past about his sexual history, about how much he drank, whether he was the treasurer of this, like he says on his yearbook page, of a group that wanted to drink 100 kegs in their senior year. They are gonna test him.
And Nora, you heard the chairman of the committee, Chuck Grassley, very expressly at the start of this hearing try to set some ground rules and say, we're talking just about this one case, but these Democratic senators are going to want to ask him about the other accusers as well. John?
All right, thank you, Nora and Nancy. Some of you will be leaving us for local news. And for the rest of you, we will your coverage will be continuing in a moment. I just want to note that we have quite a full day of testimony here, and then, of course, all of the analysis afterwards.
We'll be here all afternoon, and then for the evening news tonight.
All right. Jan, Jeff,
sure.
Gail King, thanks so much, Nora and Nancy. And for all of you, thanks for watching. Now let's take a look at some of the most powerful moments of the testimony so far.
Both Dr. Ford and Judge Kavanaugh have been through a terrible couple weeks. They and their families have received vile threats. What they have endured ought to be considered by all of us as unacceptable and a poor reflection on the state of civility in our democracy. So I want to apologize to you both for the way you've been treated, and I intend, hopefully for today's hearing, to be safe, comfortable, and dignified for both of our witnesses. I hope my colleagues will join me in this effort of a show of civility.
There's been a great deal of public discussion about the Me Too movement today versus the Year of the Woman almost 27 years ago. But while young women are standing up and saying no more, our institutions have not progressed in how they treat women who come forward. Too often, women's memories and credibility come under assault. In essence, they are put on trial and forced to defend themselves, and often re-victimized in the process.
Do you swear that the testimony you're about to give before this committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Thank you very much.
I don't have all the answers, and I don't remember as much as I would like to. But the details about that night that bring me here today are the ones I will never forget. They have been seared into my memory and have haunted me episodically as an adult. When I got to the small gathering, people were drinking beer in a small living room, family room type area on the first floor of the house. I drank one beer. Brett and Mark were visibly drunk. Early in the evening, I went up a very narrow set of stairs leading from the living room to a second floor to use the restroom. When I got to the top of the stairs, I was pushed from behind into a bedroom across from the bathroom. I couldn't see who pushed me. Brett and Mark came into the bedroom and locked the door behind them. There was music playing in the bedroom. It was turned up louder by either Brett or Mark once we were in the room. I was pushed onto the bed, and Brett got on top of me. He began running his hands over my body and grinding into me. I yelled, hoping that someone downstairs might hear me, and I tried to get away from him, but his weight was heavy. Brett groped me and tried to take off my clothes. He had a hard time because he was very inebriated and because I was wearing a one-piece bathing suit underneath my clothing. I believed he was going to rape me. I tried to yell for help. When I did, Brett put his hand over my mouth to stop me from yelling. This is what terrified me the most and has had the most lasting impact on my life. It was hard for me to breathe, and I thought that Brett was accidentally going to kill me.
My name is Rachel Mitchell.
Nice to meet you.
I just wanted to tell you the first thing that struck me from your statement this morning was that you were terrified, and I just wanted to let you know I'm very sorry. That's not right.
Well, can you tell us what impact the events had on you?
Well, I think that the sequelae of sexual assault varies by person. So for me personally, anxiety, phobia, and PTSD-like symptoms are the types of things that I've been coping with.
How did you know Brett Kavanaugh and Mark Judge? And is it possible that you would mix them up with somebody else?
No, it is not. And the person that was blamed for the incident is actually the person who introduced me to them originally. So he was a member of Columbia Country Club, and I don't want to talk about him because I think it's unfair, but he is the person that introduced me to them.
But you would not mix up somebody else with Brett Kavanaugh, is that correct?
Correct.
Or Mark Judge?
Correct.
What is the strongest memory you have? Strongest memory of the incident, something that you cannot forget. Take whatever time you need.
Indelible in the hippocampus is the laughter, the uproarious laughter between the two, and they're having fun at my expense.
In Judge Kavanaugh's opening testimony, which we will hear after you leave, this is what he says. I never had any sexual or physical encounter of any kind with Dr. Ford. I am not questioning that Dr. Ford may have been sexually assaulted by some person in some place at some time. Last night, the Republican staff of this committee released to the media a timeline that shows that they've interviewed 2 people who claimed they were the ones who actually assaulted you. I'm asking you to address this new defense of mistaken identity directly. Dr. Ford, with what degree of certainty do you believe Brett Kavanaugh assaulted you?
100%.
100%.
Sincere and thorough investigation is critical to these claims in a prosecutor's world. It may be the most basic thing that we owe a victim or a witness coming forward is to make sure that we give them a full, thorough, and sincere investigation.
You talked about the obstruction from the other side. I cannot let it go by what you've heard me say so many times, that between July 30th and September 13th, there were 45 days this committee could have been investigating this situation, and her privacy would have been protected.
Did you show a full or partial set of those marriage therapy records to the Washington Post?
I don't remember. I remember summarizing for her what they said. So I'm not quite sure if I actually gave her the record.
Okay. So it's possible that the reporter did not see these notes.
I don't know if I can't recall whether she saw them directly or if I just told her what they said.
Okay. Have you shown them to anyone else besides your counsel?
Just the counsel.
Okay. Would it be fair to say that Brett Kavanaugh's name is not listed in those notes?
His name is not listed in those notes.
Would it also be fair to say that the therapist's notes that we've been talking about say that there were 4 boys in the room?
It describes the sexual assault, and it says erroneously by 4 boys. So the therapist got the content of it wrong.
And you corrected that to the Washington Post reporter, correct?
Correct.
In your interview with the Washington Post, you said that you told your husband early in your marriage that you had been a victim of, and I quote, physical abuse. In your statement, you said that before you were married, you told him that you had experienced, quote, a sexual assault. Do these two things refer to the same incident?
Yes.
And at either point on these two times, did you use any names?
No.
Okay. It's been reported by the press that you would not submit to an interview with the committee because of your fear of flying. Is that true?
Well, I was hoping that they would come to me, but then realized that was an unrealistic request.
I also saw on your CV that you list the following interests of surf travel, and you, in parentheses, put Hawaii, Costa Rica, South Pacific Islands, and French Polynesia. Have you been all to those places?
Correct.
By airplane?
Yes.
Now, I understand that you've taken a polygraph test. Dr. Ford, that found that you were being truthful when you described what happened to you. Can you tell us why you decided to take that test?
I was meeting with attorneys. I was interviewing various attorneys, and the attorneys asked if I was willing to take it, and I said absolutely. That said, it was almost as anxiety-provoking as an airplane flight.
If we agree on nothing else today, I hope on a bipartisan basis we can agree on how much courage it has taken for you to come forward. And I think you have earned America's gratitude.
I got to her.
Yeah.
All right, good day. I'm Jeff Glor in Washington. Once again, this is CBS News continuing coverage of the Senate Judiciary Committee hearings. The committee is now taking a lunch break after hearing about 2 hours and 40 minutes of testimony from Christine Blasey Ford, who accuses Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh of sexually assaulting her when they were teenagers. She told the committee under oath she is 100% certain that it was Kavanaugh who assaulted her. She will continue her testimony in just a few minutes, and later the committee will hear from Kavanaugh, who denies these accusations. Joining us in our coverage here are CBS This Morning co-hosts Gayle King and John Dickerson, CBS News legal analyst Ricky Kleeman and Jan Crawford, who covers the Supreme Court for us. Nancy Cordes and CBS This Morning co-host Norah O'Donnell are on Capitol Hill. They were there all morning, continue there now, and political correspondent Ed O'Keefe is in the hearing room, has been popping out as needed to get interviews and fill us in on what's happening inside that room beyond what we've seen on the television screen. Ricky, I want to start with you right now because you're joining us here for the first time, and you've been so helpful helping us to understand what was about to take place before the hearing took place. What do you make of what you've heard so far?
What I said to you last night and this morning is exactly where I am. If you take someone who has been a prosecutor, no matter how good she may be, that she is not in the work of doing cross-examination. So no, of course there will not be any aha moment. That is not what is going to happen. Her job is to undermine the credibility of Dr. Ford. The difficulty is that she's having, as I see it, is that while she had one little bit of cross that really was directed at credibility, and that was about the fear of flying. Basically, you lied to us when you said that you had a fear of flying and wouldn't meet with the Republicans. And let me show you that you've flown of all these other times for all these other activities. All the rest of it has really been around the issues, authenticating documents, asking if there's little changes. None of that in the end is going to hurt her credibility. Where she's really working also is dealing with the whole issue of politics, which of course is in great part what she was hired for. And in the political realm, it's about her delay. It's about when she spoke with a representative from Congress, when she spoke with Dianne Feinstein. But that just goes in to Senator Grassley's idea.
So did you really take it that she was lying about fear of flying? Because I took it as, I don't like to fly. I fly if I absolutely have to. And then they talked about, you know, places where she's gone if there's a family vacation. But I didn't necessarily take it as a lie.
Oh, I didn't take it as a lie either. But I think that's what the prosecutor wanted to elicit.
Okay.
I didn't find find it a lie. In fact, she was very natural in her response.
Exactly.
There's also something I wanted to add about her credibility from a lawyer's point of view. And that really has to do with the fact, Jeff, when you ask me about looking at this as a lawyer, this is a woman who, although she is very accomplished and certainly wrote an articulate statement and really is a wonderful witness, she's very timid. And if she is timid in certain ways now, you go back to something Jan said earlier, we can picture her when she was this young girl, being the timid one. And who do the tough and rough and tumble boys pick on when they are looking for someone to take advantage of? The timid one.
She's very timid, but she's also very specific, don't you find?
Yes, she is.
You know, her story has not varied from the time that she first told it. So she's coming across very, her voice is very high-pitched, and she sounds very girlish. Her mannerisms may seem very tentative, but she seems very focused about what happened to her that night. She's not wavering on that
without any doubt.
whatsoever.
In graphic detail about the moment. And I've worked with sexual assault victims for so many years of my professional career before television. And they do remember the trauma and don't remember the things around it.
And unlike a court of law, there is no summation. There will be no moment when all of these threads can be put together. And so the political balance somebody has to make is listening to the whole testimony here of Dr. Ford. Has she been credible, or am I not going to believe her because of something about fear of flying, or because it's a balance, you know, right? It's whatever credibility questions have been raised, but then she has put a lot forward in terms of her own credibility to counterweight anything that Mitchell has been able to raise in her series of questions.
I completely agree, because the difficulty, by the way, no bad thoughts about Rachel Mitchell. This would be a difficult task for anyone in this situation. These 5-minute, every other interval, you cannot get momentum to be able to get to your points. So Rachel Mitchell, just by virtue of the structure, is put in a difficult situation.
But she does seem, Ricky, to be trying to take us someplace, and I'm still not clear where she's trying to take us.
I think she's just picking at different details of credibility. I don't think that she can get to an end point.
If you're waiting for that grand aha
it's not
moment,
happening.
right? So I think that's important to keep in mind here as we watch senators start to trickle back into the room here. So we have let's just set up the timeline here now for everyone. We have to hear still from how many senators? And that's Republican and Democratic.
Well, we know that Mitchell, there are 3 more rounds of Republican senators that she will be speaking for. So that's a total of 15 minutes of questioning that she has before her. And then on the Democratic side, I don't know whether it's 3 or 4, but it's roughly the equivalent.
So 2 hours and 40 minutes so far of Christine Blasey Ford. We're looking at another 40 to 60 minutes, something like that.
At least.
And then we're talking about a break because she doesn't want to be in the same room with Brett Kavanaugh, but then he would be questioned for, one would think, around the same time. So we started at 10 o'clock this morning. If Christine Blasey Ford's questioning ends 2-ish, that's sort of the time frame we're looking at this afternoon as the nation remains captivated by all that we're seeing here right now.
Well, she started out by saying that she was terrified to be here today, and she certainly looks terrified. They had a very touching moment, I thought, when Senator Blumenthal was congratulating her, encouraging her, and thanking her for coming forward. She really looked like she wanted to cry at that moment. And I thought it was interesting that Senator Blumenthal brought up his colleague, Senator Lindsey Graham, to pick from writings of Senator Lindsey Graham, who talked about how difficult it is for victims to come forward and speak up. What were you going to say?
Well, I was just going to ask Jan, if you're Brett Kavanaugh's legal team and you're watching this, what are you taking away from it as you try to construct what he's going to do when he comes under questioning?
I think that he is keeping his focus. I don't, and if he's watching this, I'm not so sure. I think he is keeping his focus, and he wrote this statement himself. It was not vetted by the White House. It is his words, and I think that they don't want him to be influenced by anything that they saw from her this morning, because it's now going to be, when it's his turn, he has to somehow come across as equally credible. And if he's speaking from the heart, and this is what he means, and this is what he feels, that's what people can connect with. You know, we saw Senator Klobuchar and several people make the point that, you know, this is a job interview for the Supreme Court. It is no longer a job interview for Brett Kavanaugh. This is not about a seat on the Supreme Court. It's about a life.
It's his
This
life.
is his integrity, his name. However, it's the same thing that Clarence Thomas said. He's worked his entire life to build this name, his character, his integrity, his family, his children. That's what this is about now. So in many ways, when Kavanaugh begins to speak, this is much more for him than whether he's going to serve on the United States
He's
Supreme
talking
Court.
about his life, Jan, but Dr. Ford said she felt it was her civic duty to come forward.
Absolutely. No, these are
which
just
I think
the stakes.
is also so interesting. That she did not want to be here, and that if he hadn't made it until the final round, she tried to get it before he got on the short list.
And she made that was interesting, too.
And I thought that added to her credibility.
Yes. What Jan's put her finger on, though, is the emotional resonance for him, because people have had an emotional reaction to Dr. Ford in terms of her credibility, her suffering, the pathos of connecting to her. So what does Brett Kavanaugh bring to the table that has that accesses that same emotion? I think what Jan's saying is he is feeling a personal attack on his honor. It's not just about a job position here, and presumably that will be his effort to try to counter the emotional, what we've seen emotionally so far.
And what he's been advised to do is forget about the Fox interview, forget about being careful. You just have to talk. What is it like? What are you feeling? You speak from the heart.
And it's certainly possible that both witnesses can come across as not being evasive and being as honest as they appear, as they're trying to be, at least. So in other words, they both could have what could be termed successful testimony, and then it's up to the senators to figure out what they're going to do and how they're going to vote.
It's also the fact, Jeff, that I think we haven't discussed, which is, let's assume, just for the moment, let's assume he's confirmed. He has to go into that court as someone who has now gone public in terms of the Fox interview, but has also had to be part of these events, to a court of the group of 8 who are notoriously private. They do not want cameras in their courtroom. They do not want their pictures out there in the world. They do not like things that take away from the dignity and integrity of the United States Supreme Court. So even if he is confirmed, you will have protesters outside for a long, long time. He may not be embraced, to say the least, in the collegiality of the court.
That's a good point. I think the other point to keep in mind here is that no matter what happens with the vote, both of these lives have been irrevocably changed.
And their families.
Forever.
Forever. It was interesting that when the hearing started, Senator Grassley said, "I'd like to apologize." He started the hearing with an apology, guys, to both sides, to say they both had a terrible couple of weeks. They have both received death threats. They have both received, they have both been accused of terrible things, and that he wanted to lead this hearing with decorum, with civility. So far, so good. But there did seem to be a moment between Senator Grassley and Senator Klobuchar, too.
Over the question of whether to allow the polygraph, yes, when he said...
There seemed to be a little tension between the two of them at that moment.
You got what you wanted. That should have been enough. That was,
And it's also when Dr. Russ's lawyer, Dr. Ford's lawyer got involved by putting out there that we wanted to call the polygrapher to the stand in this hearing. And so the only way I know that you could look at the underlying data of the polygraph and have it explained would be if you had the polygrapher. You can't just throw that data at the senator.
Prosecutor Mitchell tried to make a point about that with the polygraph expert. Like, why did they do it in a hotel room? Why was it happen there? Because they were talking about flying, it seemed, and she said, well, I left my grandmother's funeral. So even that seemed like she was trying to land something there, but that didn't go very far either.
No.
And what does it mean for Mitchell's questioning, Ricky, in your estimation, when it's 5 minutes and then stop? And then,
it's a disastrous situation for Mitchell or anyone who would be sitting in her shoes. You can't get momentum. You cannot get to a point that you're trying to get to and then have it broken up by 5 minutes of someone else and come back to it as if you weren't interrupted. It just doesn't work. The other thing that happened...
Can you get momentum, Ricky, when you only have 5 minutes to question anyway?
Very, very tough. We'll watch with Kamala Harris.
Okay.
We'll see what momentum is. But one of the things I do think, too, about civility and the beginning with the really thoughtful position of Senator Grassley at the beginning, that when Brett Kavanaugh comes to testify, there have been a couple of these moments of where people have gotten at each other. But if the Democrats go after Kavanaugh in a way that does not appear to be respectful, that's a mistake.
Let's go to Nora. She's still on Capitol Hill. Nora?
Hi, thank you so much. I just wanted to point out, too, one of the things that was mentioned earlier, there are actually 6 senators left, 3 Republicans and 3 Democrats. And in fact, it is pretty interesting when you look at who actually is coming up to stay tuned to this next part of this hearing. Nancy Cordes is here with me. 3 really interesting Democratic senators.
Correct. Mazie Hirono of Hawaii, who obviously has gotten so much attention throughout this process, saying at one point men need to step up or they need to shut up. She has been very outspoken about women being believed. And then you have Kamala Harris of California, former Attorney General of the state of California.
Who is considered a likely 2020 contender for president.
Along with Cory Booker of New Jersey, who is also yet to question Christine Blasey Ford and had that Spartacus moment at the confirmation hearings for Judge Kavanaugh. And so where they go with their questions is very important. But I think it's also important to step back and remember at the end of the day that this is not a legal process. It is a political process. And no matter how believable Christine Blasey Ford is, if Republicans believe that this is their once-in-a-lifetime chance to change the direction of the court, they may ignore that.
They're going to vote. One of the questions, a couple of big things we talked about here, whether she is politically motivated, whether this has been a con job, has been described by the president in another allegation, whether this is a sham, a smear by a Democratic-leaning group. She seemed to put that to rest today, Dr. Ford.
Right, and something came up that interestingly hasn't come up a lot in the past couple of weeks, which is that she began to come forward and reach out to the Washington Post and her congresswoman before Kavanaugh was even nominated, when he was on a short list of other conservative lawyers and judges. And had she been politically motivated to bring down a Republican nominee, why did she report what had happened allegedly between herself and Kavanaugh before he was ever nominated, when, you know, there were several other conservative judges who were on the list as well?
This falls under the credibility of these people who have challenged Judge Kavanaugh. The first is they're politically motivated. The second one, a case of mistaken identity, one that she probably was assaulted or could have been assaulted, but it wasn't Judge Kavanaugh. You saw the Democrats really try and bolster her credibility today, multiple times asking her, is she absolutely sure? She answered the question, I am 100% sure that it was Brett Kavanaugh who sexually assaulted me. And then, interestingly, she spoke specifically about why she remembers it. And there was that line, as all of you remember, she said, indelible in the hippocampus is the laughter, the uproarious laughter between the two, and they're having fun at my expense. Think about what she described. Not that they just assaulted her, but then they laughed at her and mocked her. And that, to me, was one of the most chilling moments of the morning when she said that. Also, another time in the testimony, specifically referencing, well, how do you know it's him? Senator Feinstein asked. And she said, the same way I know I'm talking to you, basic memory function. She said the level of norepinephrine and epinephrine in the brain that codes memories in the brain. She is trying to specifically plant in people's mind that there had been a physiological response to the trauma that implanted or printed on her memory this thing that happened 36 years ago, because it has been the question of credibility that it's been at the center of this, that everyone asks, how can you remember something so long ago, especially when people were drinking?
And Patrick Leahy of Vermont, who is a longtime Democrat, was on the committee back when Anita Hill testified, made a very interesting point at the start of this hearing. He said, any practiced liar can come up with a story in which every detail is recalled. But in the case of normal human memory, there are going to be things that you remember and things that you don't remember. And the fact that she's honest about what she recalls and what she doesn't makes her more believable in his eyes.
And here is that exchange with Senator Leahy, as you point out, who was back on the Senate Judiciary Committee some 27 years ago. Here is him speaking to that very issue of what happened and the laughter that was involved. I apologize. The control room had said that was ready, but I think I described it accurately, which was that there was that indelible moment that seared in her mind. That idea that someone was mocking you in that moment. As you point out, we have 3 more Democratic senators that will ask specific questions, as well as 15 minutes by the special prosecutor.
Correct. And then we know that Judge Kavanaugh has left his home. He's on his way here. There will probably be a short break once she has finished. She has said she doesn't want to be in the same room as Judge Kavanaugh, so she will depart. He will take that hot seat. And while she has asked for periodic breaks, this is all very new to her, he's pretty comfortable in this setting. We saw that in his confirmation hearings. He sat there all day long. He said, I don't need a break. And so we expect that his testimony will probably go straight through, and you'll go through all of the 21 senators. And the question is, will Republicans continue to defer to Rachel Mitchell, the prosecutor, or because they have this comfort level with him, the optics are different, they aren't grilling a potential female victim, will they want to converse with him themselves?
Yeah. The very question, in talking with both Democratic and Republican senators this morning, the Democrats have told me they are going to get graphic. This is going to be a question of his character and his credibility. They're going to ask him whether he was stumbling drunk on multiple occasions, not only in high school, but in college. They're going to ask him about the things that he wrote on his yearbook page when he was an 18-year-old senior in high school, about the types of activities he was engaged in. They are going to ask him about his sexual history, the truthfulness that he gave, whether he was truthful when he, in that Fox News interview, said that he was a virgin for a while after. The Democrats say they're going to go there. I mean, that's what we're going to see this afternoon. And then a Republican Senator, Lindsey Graham, said to me, if they do that, I'm going to get in their grill. The fireworks are going to happen this afternoon.
And I can guarantee you're going to see a fight between Democrats and Republicans about whether it's appropriate to discuss in this hearing accusations by the 2 other women who have come forward, Deborah Ramirez and Ms. Swetnick, because Republicans will say, we're here to talk about this allegation. But Democrats are trying to establish that there's a pattern here. And so they're going to want to talk about those accusations.
And Jan Crawford, I want to ask you about this, because Jan, you had really mentioned before about how he's not just fighting for this job, he's fighting now for his integrity as a person. And you have done some of the most interesting analysis on this, having covered Justice Thomas, who, despite what happened, was ultimately confirmed. But I know you believe it has actually affected his jurisprudence and how he has ruled on the court and his entire life, right?
Well, and certainly before, in the reporting I did when I was writing my book, before the kind of strategy was unrolled that they were going to try to block Thomas and have the Hill hearings, there were voices in the Democratic Party that said, if we are going to try to do this, if we're going to do this to Clarence Thomas, we have to win. Because if he gets on the court after what he's been put through, we've lost him forever. You know, he might have been open to certain arguments. He might have been, but they took that gamble anyway. And of course, he's become probably the most conservative justice on the Supreme Court. He doesn't really compromise his own views at all. He does not care what the media thinks at all. He does not care what people write about him. He believes he told his story. He was 100% falsely accused, and the media didn't listen. The Democrats didn't listen. They subjected him to what he believes was a travesty. He's described it as he died. The person he was before died the day he found out that he was going to have to go through this. Is
that the tactic you think that Kavanaugh should take or is taking?
I think what Kavanaugh has been advised, and I think it just is in terms of just human nature, it has to be accurate, that you can't be someone else. And Brett Kavanaugh is not Clarence Thomas. Brett Kavanaugh grew up outside Washington, D.C. He went to an elite boarding school. Clarence Thomas grew up in poverty, yes. Integrating all-white schools. He fought and scratched his way to where he was going to be. Not that Kavanaugh didn't work hard for it. Very different backgrounds, very different people. So if he comes out angry and really pushing back on Democrats, as Thomas did, it's remarkable to go back and look at those transcripts, how he was lashing out at the Senate for what they were doing to a life he had built and was proud of. If Kavanaugh, it may not ring true, he has to be Brett Kavanaugh, and however this is affecting him.
But so far what he said, Jan, is that this is crazy town, and that crazy town, that this is a total smear campaign.
Right.
That's been his tactic so far.
And also he said that it was like Twilight Zone. Like, what is this? He doesn't. So whatever response we see from Kavanaugh, it better be a sincere one if he expects people to kind of connect with what he's saying.
And isn't the political question at the end of the day, whether by the time this day is over, whether Republicans who were moving to confirm Kavanaugh anyway have been given something to hang on to afresh, to say, I'm going to continue going in that direction, or has a roadblock been thrown up for a handful of Republicans, maybe one or two, maybe two, that keeps them from going on the direction they were previously going? So it's one storyline that either says I can continue going in that direction, or one, why I went off that path.
And I think the other storyline you'll see emerging from Rachel Mitchell's questioning potentially here this afternoon is that there's more focus on the timing of the introduction of the accusation, I think, the how and the why, versus the actual assault and what happened back then. You can see that. I mean, Mitchell's basically finished with the questioning of what happened in 1982 or the early 80s, and now it's talking about the timing, and that is what happened between July and
I'm actually really surprised by that. I thought there would have been questions about how long did she think the assault was, and that suggests to me that this is purely mistaken identity. They're not going to try to say, like, well, maybe, you know, it really didn't happen the way you remember it. You know, maybe it was just horseplay. You know, if he was really trying to rape you, he could have certainly gotten to a swimsuit, wouldn't have let you go. You know, there have been no questions along the lines of how long was this assault? If someone were trying to rape you, why didn't they? None of that. So it suggests to me that if we don't hear that, this is purely going to be, this wasn't Brett Kavanaugh. This may have happened exactly like you described, but it wasn't Brett Kavanaugh.
And
that's going to be the defense.
They'll just assert that, not try to build a fact pattern.
No,
to
I think they are going
that.
to try to build a fact pattern. And there are
they've
witnesses.
Only got 3 more questioners
to go.
True. I mean, in this process right now,
a fact pattern to
say that it was somebody else other than Kavanaugh.
Right. For example, if there were music upstairs blaring, but it was very quiet downstairs where one of your close friends was, and then all of a sudden you go upstairs, there's music, and then it turns off, and they fall down the stairs, and then you run out of the room, why wouldn't your friend remember that? So, you know, there will be moments. I mean, we saw that established this morning, that there was no music downstairs, but there was loud music. So
but Jan,
you will see.
How far can you get with it's not Brett Kavanaugh when someone says, I'm 100% certain, just as certain as I am looking from you to her?
That's where the therapist notes come in. That's where all of the questions that she was asking this morning about.
But she has always identified Brett Kavanaugh.
Not by name. Not according to her husband, but in the therapist notes, his name is not mentioned, and then she's not provided. Again, I'm not. These are things that kind of came out this morning.
But
so
she
you
told
go
friends
to the
he was
memory.
a judge. She had told friends he was a judge. She might not have named his name, but she said he was a prominent judge.
But not for 30 years.
And she also has always assumed it was Brett Kavanaugh, but hasn't said it was Brett Kavanaugh. She is not going to waver from that. It's one of the things about cross-examination, about just dealing with her memory. We don't know not only how long the assault may have taken place, we don't know what the lighting was. We don't know, with a lot of factors about how she observed them. And if you decide, and memory experts could tell you, if you decide that someone did something, and then you remember, what you remember is your memory, not the fact.
I know this
Ricky,
isn't
as we
a
look
court
at
of
the
law.
screen, Gail, apologies, because Christine Blasey Ford has been seated now once again as she continues what would be, I guess, part 3 of the first part of this hearing before we hear from Judge Kavanaugh. You see the bottle of Coke next to her. She asked for that caffeine.
Yes, I saw.
Right
I saw
after she first started.
But Ricky, I know
we're hearing now from Chuck Grassley. So let's listen, and I think if we could.
I'm just organizing my papers. I'll be ready
Next
in
section of the hearing.
20 seconds. Thank you. I'm ready.
Okay. Senator Hirono.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, is it your intent to cede all Republican senators' time to your prosecutor rather than they themselves ceding their time to her?
Yes.
We all know that the prosecutor, even though this clearly is not a criminal proceeding, is asking Dr. Ford all kinds of questions about what happened before and after, but basically not during the attack. The prosecutor should know that sexual assault survivors often do not remember peripheral information such as what happened before or after the traumatic event. And yet, she will persist in asking these questions, all to undermine the memory and basically the credibility of Dr. Ford. But we all know Dr. Ford's memory of the assault is very clear. Dr. Ford, the Republicans prosecutor has asked you all kinds of questions about who you called and when, asking details that would be asked in a cross-examination of a witness in a criminal trial. But this is not a criminal proceeding. This is a confirmation proceeding. I think I know what she's trying to get at. So I'll just ask you very plainly, Dr. Ford, is there a political motivation for your coming forward with your account of the assault by Brett Kavanaugh?
No, and I'd like to reiterate that, again, I was trying to get the information to you while there was still a list of other,
thank you,
what looked like equally qualified candidates.
And yet they're not here to testify. Dr. Ford, I'd like to join my colleagues who have thanked you for coming forward today. And I and we all admire you for what you're doing. And I understand why you have come forward. You wanted us and the American people to know what you knew about the character of the man we are considering for a lifetime appointment to the Supreme Court. I want to take a moment also to note the significant personal sacrifices you've made to come forward to share your traumatic experience with us and the American people. You've had to move, you've had death threats, all manner of basically re-victimization experiences have come your ways. But by coming forward, you have inserted the question of character into this nomination and hopefully back into American life, and rightly so. We should be made to face the question of who it is we are putting in positions of power and decision-making in this country. We should look the question square in the face: does character matter? Do our values, our real values about what is right and what is wrong, and about whether we treat our fellow human beings with dignity and respect, do they matter anymore? I believe they do. And I believe the reaction we have seen to this coverage right now and your courage all over this country shows us that we're not alone. You're not alone. That women and men all across America are disgusted and sick and tired of the way basic human decency has been driven from our public life. The president admits on tape to assaulting women. He separates children from their parents. He takes basic health care protections from those who need them most. He nominates and stands behind a man who stands credibly accused of a horrible act. I again want to thank you for coming forward. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent that on 6 items consisting of various statements, letters, fact sheet, posts are inserted into the record.
Is that one request, or you want me to wait for 6?
Well, I have 6 separate items.
Okay.
They consist. I can go over them for you.
Okay, no.
I would like to.
Let me not interrupt you. Okay. Your request is accepted without objection.
Thank you. And I would like to read from an item that has already been entered into the record, but this is from a letter from the National Task Force to End Sexual and Domestic Violence. The letter states, and I quote this letter, "This moment has become a crucible. It's a test of our progress. Do we start by believing victims of sexual assault and treating them with dignity, or don't we? So far, Senate leaders are failing that test, prejudging the outcome of the hearing, sympathizing with her perpetrator, attacking her credibility. They send a message to every victim of sexual violence that their pain doesn't matter, that they do not deserve justice, and that for them, fair treatment is out of reach. This will only serve to drive victims into the shadows and further embolden abusers." Once again, Dr. Ford, thank you very much. This is a moment for our country. Mahalo.
Senator, Ms. Mitchell for Senator Crapo.
Good afternoon. Hi. when we left off, we were still talking about the polygraph, and I believe you said it hasn't been paid for yet. Is that correct?
Let me put an end to this mystery. Her lawyers have paid for her polygraph.
As is routine.
As is routine.
Dr. Ford, do you expect the price of that polygraph to be passed on to you?
I'm not sure yet. I haven't taken a look at all of the costs involved in this. We've relocated now twice, so I haven't kept track of all of that paperwork, but I'm sure I have a lot of work to do to catch up on all of that later.
I get you have a lot going on, and you've had that for several months. But is it your understanding that someone else is going to assist you with some of these fees, including the cost for your polygraph?
I'm aware that there's been several GoFundMe sites that I haven't had a chance to figure out how to manage those because I've never had one
and I'm sorry,
done for me.
Several what?
GoFundMe sites that have raised money primarily for our security detail. So I'm not even quite sure how to collect that money and how to distribute it yet. I haven't been able to focus on that.
Okay. In your testimony this morning, you stated that Senator Feinstein sent you a letter on August 31st of this year. Is that right?
August 31st. Let me see. I sent her a letter on July 30th, and I don't have the date. I'd have to pull up my email to find out the date of her email to me saying that it was right before the hearings that she was going to maintain the confidentiality of the letter.
Say that again. It was till right before the hearings.
That's my memory, but I can look it up for you if you would like the exact date. I could pull it up on my email.
Oh, yeah. I want to make sure.
Counsel?
I want to make sure I understood what you said.
That document's been turned over to, in response to a request for documents. You have it.
Thank you, counsel. I want to make sure I understood what you said. Was it your understanding it was going to be kept confidential up until right before the hearing?
It was my understanding that it was going to be kept confidential, period.
Period? Okay. Between your polygraph on August the 7th and your receipt of the letter from Senator Feinstein, did you or anyone on your behalf speak to any member of Congress or congressional staff about these allegations?
I personally did not.
So my question was, did you or anybody on your behalf?
What do you mean? Did someone speak for me?
Somebody that is working with you or helping you? Did somebody at your behest, on your behalf, speak to somebody in Congress or staff?
I'm not sure.
Okay.
I'm not sure how those exchanges went, but I didn't speak to anyone.
Okay. Is it possible that somebody did?
I think so. It would be possible. I'm guessing it would be possible, but I don't know.
Okay.
Excuse me, you've asked her not to guess, and now you're asking her what's possible. So I think if you want to ask her what she knows, you should ask her what she knows.
Is that an objection, counsel?
It is.
I'll have the chair rule on that.
I don't know I don't understand.
Unless there's a legal reason for not answering it, on advice of your counsel.
So I don't totally understand the question, but I didn't speak with anyone during that time frame other than my counsel.
Okay. You've said repeatedly that you did not think that that letter that you wrote on July 30th was going to be released to the public. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. And is it true that you did not authorize it to be released at any time?
Correct.
Okay. Besides your attorneys, did you provided that letter to Senator Feinstein, is that correct?
I provided her a letter on July 30th.
We're talking about the July 30th letter.
Okay.
And you provided that letter to Senator Feinstein, correct? Is that a yes?
Yes.
And you provided the letter to Representative Eshoo to deliver to Senator Feinstein?
Yes.
Besides those two individuals, Representative Eshoo and Senator Feinstein, and your attorneys, did you provide that letter to anyone else?
No.
Do you know how that letter became public?
No.
After that letter was made public or leaked, did you reach back out to the Washington Post?
I reached out to the Washington, well, they were continuously reaching out to me, and I was not responding. But the time that I did respond and agree to do the sit down was once the reporters started showing up at my home and at my workplace.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Ford, thank you for being here. I just want to remind everyone that this is not a courtroom. This is not a legal proceeding. You are here under your own volition. And though that a prosecutor has been engaged here to represent my colleagues, you're here, as you said, out of a civic duty. And I want to join my colleagues that it's really more than that. You know, our founding documents talk about civic duty. Our Declaration of Independence talks about for this country pledging your lives, your fortunes, and your sacred honor. And anybody who's read your testimony knows what you've had to sacrifice by coming forward. Your life has been upended. You have received vicious, hateful threats, death threats. You've had to move out of your family home to some expense, I imagine, to you and your family. You've had to engage security to some expense. You've had to deal with incredible challenges. And what's amazing, and I want to join my colleagues in thanking you for your courage and bravery in coming forward, all to help us deal with one of the most important obligations a senator has, to advise and consent on one of the branches of our government, the highest courts in the land, an individual going before a lifetime appointment. And you even said that the president had a lot of folks on that list, and your fear was that this individual who assaulted you would ascend to that seat. That's correct, right?
Correct.
Yes, and it is correct that you have given a lot of resources, taken a lot of threats to come forward, correct?
Correct.
Assaults on your dignity and your humanity?
Absolutely.
How has it affected your children?
They're doing fairly well considering. Thank you for asking.
And your husband?
Doing fairly well considering. Yeah, thank you. We have a very supportive community.
That's good to hear. I want to use a different word for your courage because this is more, as much as this hearing is about a Supreme Court justice, the reality is by you coming forward, your courage, you are affecting the culture of our country. We have a wonderful nation, an incredible culture, but there are dark elements that allow unconscionable levels of, unacceptable levels of sexual assault and harassment that are affecting girls and boys and affecting men and women, from big media outlets to corporations to factory floors to servers in restaurants to our intimate spaces and homes and apartments all around this country. I stepped out during the break and was deluged with notes from friends all around the country, social media posts, that there are literally hundreds of thousands of people watching your testimony right now. And note after note that I got, people in tears, feeling pain and anguish, not just feeling your pain, but feeling their own, who have not come forward. You are opening up to open air hurt and pain that goes on across this country. And for that, the word I would use, it's nothing short of heroic. Because what you're doing for our nation right now, besides giving testimony germane to one of the most sacred obligations of our offices, is you are speaking truth that this country needs to understand. And how we deal with survivors who come forward right now is unacceptable. And the way we deal with this, unfortunately, allows for the continued darkness of this culture to exist. And your brilliance, shining light onto this, speaking your truth, is nothing short of heroic. But to the matter at hand, one of my colleagues who I have a lot of respect for, and I do consider him a friend, went to the Senate floor and spoke truth to both sides of the political aisle. Senator Flake said yesterday, this is a lifetime appointment, and this is said to be a deliberative body. In the interest of due diligence and fairness, her claims must be fully aired and considered. I agree with him. But you've asked for things that would give a full airing, from corroborating witnesses to be called. You've submitted to an intrusive polygraph test. Can you answer for me, how do you feel that all the things that could have been done thoroughly to help this deliberative body have not been honored in this so-called investigation?
I wish that I could be more helpful and that others could be more helpful and that we could collaborate in a way that would get at more information.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I'd just like to introduce for the record 7 letters from Lambda Legal, from Mormon Women for Ethical Government, youth-led organizations around this country, the international unions, bricklayers, allied craft workers, a letter from 295 survivors of sexual violence in support of Dr. Ford, and a letter from 1,600 men. It's a campaign in support of Dr. Ford, and those who want to assert, men and women, that survivors of sexual violence are not opportunists, do not have political access to crime, but are coming forward with courage and with heart to speak their truth and try to end the scourge of sexual assault and violence in our country.
Without objection, so ordered. Senator Tillis, Ms. Mitchell for Senator Tillis.
Dr. Ford, in choosing attorneys, did anyone help you with the choice on who to choose?
Various people referred me to lawyers that they knew in the Washington, D.C. area. So as you know, I grew up in this area, so I asked some family members and friends, and they referred me to like divorce attorneys that might know somebody that might know somebody, and I ended up interviewing several law firms from the D.C. area.
And did anybody besides friends and family refer you to any attorneys?
I think that the staff of Dianne Feinstein's office suggested the possibility of some attorneys.
Okay. Including the 2 that are sitting on either side of you?
Not both of them, no.
Okay. We've heard a lot about FBI investigations. When did you personally first request an FBI investigation?
How many weeks ago? I don't know. I guess when we first started talking about the possibility of a hearing, I was hoping that there would be a more thorough investigation.
Would that investigation have been something that you would have submitted to an interview?
I would be happy to cooperate with the FBI, yes.
Would you have been happy to submit to an interview by staff members from this committee?
Absolutely.
Okay. Besides, you mentioned some GoFundMe accounts. Besides those, are there any other efforts outside of your own personal finances to pay for your legal fees or any of the costs incurred?
It's my understanding that some of my team is working on a pro bono basis, but I don't know the exact details. And there are members of the community in Palo Alto that have the means to contribute to help me with the security detail, et cetera.
Have you been provided?
I think I can help you with that. Both counsel are doing this pro bono. We are not being paid, and we have no expectation of being paid.
Thank you, counsel. Have you seen any of the questions that I was going to ask you today?
No.
You've been asked a few questions by other people as well. Have you seen any of those questions in advance?
No.
Have you been told them in advance?
No.
And likewise with my questions, have you been told my questions in advance?
Definitely not.
Okay. You mentioned about some possible information, such as Mark Judge worked at the supermarket. I want to ask you about someone else. You mentioned that there was a classmate who was really sort of the connection between you and Brett Kavanaugh. Who was this person?
I think that case with Mr. Whalen, who was looking at my LinkedIn page and then trying to blame the person, I just don't feel like it's right for us to be talking about that.
I'm not trying to blame anybody. I just want to know who the common friend that you and...
The person that Mr. Whalen was trying to say looked like Mr. Kavanaugh.
Okay. How long did you know this person?
Maybe for a couple of months we socialized, but he also was a member of the same country club, and I knew his younger brother as well.
Okay. So a couple months before this took place?
Yes.
Okay. How would you characterize your relationship with him both before and after this took place, this person?
He was somebody that we used the phrase I went out with. I wouldn't say date. I went out with for a few months. That was how we termed it at the time. And after that, we were distant friends and ran into each other periodically at Columbia Country Club, but I didn't see him often. But I saw his brother and him several times.
Was this person the only common link between you and Judge Kavanaugh?
He's the only one that I would be able to name right now that I would like to not name, but you know who I mean. But there are certainly other members of Columbia Country Club that were common friends, or they were more acquaintances of mine and friends of Mr. Kavanaugh.
Okay. Can you describe all of the other social interactions that you had with Mr. Kavanaugh?
Briefly, yes, I can. There were, during freshman and sophomore year, particularly my sophomore year, which would have been his junior year of high school, 4 to 5 parties that my friends and I attended that were attended also by him.
Okay. Did anything happen at these events, like we're talking about? Besides the time we're talking about?
You can answer that question, then I'll go to Senator Harris. Go ahead and answer that question.
There was no sexual assault at any of those events. Is that what you're asking?
Yes.
Yes, those were just parties.
Or anything inappropriate is what I'm asking.
Well, maybe we can go into more detail when there's more time. I feel time pressure on that question.
Okay.
Yeah.
Senator.
I'm happy to answer in further detail if you want me to.
I'm sorry. Go ahead and finish answering your question.
Oh, okay. Did you want me to describe those parties? Or
Shouldn't we leave this to the next round, Mr. Chairman?
Answer the question.
I'm just happy to describe them if you wanted me to, and I'm happy to not. It's just whatever you want.
Maybe this will
whatever is your preference.
Cut to the chase. My question is, was there anything else that was sexually inappropriate, any inappropriate sexual behavior on the part of Mr. Kavanaugh towards you at any of these other functions?
No.
Okay.
Senator Harris.
Dr. Ford, first of all, just so we can level set, you know you are not on trial. You are not on trial. You are sitting here before members of the United States Senate's Judiciary Committee because you had the courage to come forward because, as you have said, you believe it was your civic duty. I was struck in your testimony by what you indicated as your intention when you first let anyone associated with these hearings know about it. And what you basically said is you reached out to your representative in the United States Congress, hoping that person would inform the White House before Judge Kavanaugh had been named. That's extremely persuasive about your motivation for coming forward. And so I want to thank you. I want to thank you for your courage, and I want to tell you I believe you. I believe you. And I believe many Americans across this country believe you. And what I find striking about your testimony is you remember key, searing details of what happened to you. You told your husband and therapist, two of the most intimate of your confidants, and you told them years ago about this assault. You have shared your experience with multiple friends years after that and before these hearings ever started. I know, having personally prosecuted sexual assault cases and child sexual assault cases, that study after study shows trauma, shame, and the fear of consequences almost always cause survivors to, at the very least, delay reporting if they ever report at all. Police recognize that. Prosecutors recognize that. Medical and mental health professionals recognize that. The notes from your therapy sessions were created long before this nomination and corroborate what you have said today. You have passed a polygraph and submitted the results to this committee. Judge Kavanaugh has not. You have called for outside witnesses to testify and for expert witnesses to testify. Judge Kavanaugh has not. But most importantly, you have called for an independent FBI investigation into the facts. Judge Kavanaugh has not. And we owe you that. We owe the American people that. And let's talk about why this is so important. Contrary to what has been said today, the FBI does not reach conclusions. The FBI investigates. It interviews witnesses, gathers facts, and then presents that information to the United States Senate for our consideration and judgment. This committee knows that, in spite of what you've been told. In 1991, during a similar hearing, one of my Republican colleagues in this committee stated these claims were taken seriously by having the Federal Bureau of Investigations launch an inquiry to determine their validity. The FBI fulfilled its duty and issued a confidential report. Well, that could have and should have been done here. This morning, it was said that this could have been investigated confidentially back in July. But this also could have been investigated in the last 11 days since you came forward. Yet that has not happened. The FBI could have interviewed Mark Judge, Patrick Smith, Leland Kaiser, you, and Judge Kavanaugh on these issues. The FBI could have examined various maps that have been presented by the prosecutor who stands in for the United States senators on this committee. The FBI could have gathered facts about the music or the conversation or any other details about the gathering that occurred that evening. That is standard procedure in a sexual assault case. In fact, the manual that was signed off by Ms. Mitchell, the manual that is posted on the Maricopa County Attorney's website as a guiding principle and best practices for what should happen with sexual assault cases, highlights the details of what should happen in terms of the need for an objective investigation into any sexual assault case. It says, quote, effective investigation requires cooperation with a multidisciplinary team that includes medical professionals, victim advocates, dedicated forensic interviewers, criminalists, and other law enforcement members. The manual also stresses the importance of obtaining outside witness information. You have bravely come forward. You have bravely come forward. And I want to thank you because you clearly have nothing to gain for what you have done. You have been a true patriot in fighting for the best of who we are as a country. I believe you are doing that because you love this country. And I believe history will show that you are a true profile in courage at this moment in time in the history of our country, and I thank you.
Senator Kennedy now, so proceed, Ms. Mitchell.
Dr. Ford, we're almost done. Just a couple cleanup questions. First of all, which of your two lawyers did Senator Feinstein's office recommend?
The Katz.
I'm sorry?
The Katz firm.
Okay. And When you did leave that night, did Leland Kaiser, now Kaiser, ever follow up with you and say, hey, what happened to you?
I've had communications with her recently.
Mm-hmm. I'm talking about like the next day.
Oh, no. She didn't know about the event. She was downstairs during the event, and I did not share it with her.
Okay. Are you aware that the three people at the party besides yourself and Brett Kavanaugh have given statements under penalty of felony to the committee?
Yes.
And are you aware of what those statements say?
Yes.
Are you aware that they say that they have no memory or knowledge of such a party?
Yes.
Okay. Do you have any particular motives to ascribe to Leland?
I guess we could take those one at a time. Leland has significant health challenges, and I'm happy that she's focusing on herself and getting the health treatment that she needs. And she let me know that she needed her lawyer to take care of this for her, and she texted me right afterward with an apology and good wishes and etc. So I'm glad that she's taking care of herself. I don't expect that PJ and Leland would remember this evening. It was a very unremarkable party. It was not one of their more notorious parties because nothing remarkable happened to them that evening. They were downstairs. And Mr. Judge is a different story. I would expect that he would remember that this happened.
Understood. Senator Harris just questioned you from the Maricopa County Protocol on Sexual Assault. That's the paper she was holding up. Are you aware that, and you know, I've been really impressed today because you've talked about norepinephrine and cortisol and what we call in the profession basically the neurobiological effects of trauma. Have you also educated yourself on the best way to get to memory and truth in terms of interviewing victims of trauma?
For me, interviewing victims of trauma?
No, the best way to do it, the best practices for interviewing victims of trauma.
No.
Okay. Would you believe me if I told you that there's no study that says that this setting in 5-minute increments is the best way to do that?
We'll stipulate to that.
We can stipulate. Thank you, counsel.
Agreed.
Did you know that the best way to do it is to have a trained interviewer talk to you one-on-one in a private setting and to let you do the talking, just let you do a narrative? Did you know that?
That makes a lot of sense.
Does make a lot of sense, doesn't it?
Yes.
And then to follow up, obviously to fill in the details and ask for clarification. Does that make sense as well?
Yes.
And the research is done by a lot of people in the child abuse field. Two of the more prominent ones in the sexual assault field are Giesel and Fisher, who've talked about it. And it's called a cognitive interview. This is not a cognitive interview. Did anybody ever advise you from Senator Feinstein's office or from Representative Eshu's office to go get a forensic interview?
No.
Instead, you were advised to get an attorney and take a polygraph. Is that right?
Many people advised me to get an attorney. Once I had an attorney, my attorney and I discussed using the polygraph.
And instead of submitting to an interview in California, we're having a hearing here today in 5-minute increments. Is that right?
I agree that's what was agreed upon by the collegial group here.
Okay. Thank you. I have no further questions.
Okay, I have something to submit for the record. We received 3 statements under penalty of felony from 3 witnesses identified by Dr. Ford, Mark Judge, Leland Kaiser, and Patrick Smith. All 3 denied any knowledge of the incident or gathering described by Dr. Ford. Without objection, I'll enter in the record.
Mr. Chairman, I have something for the record as well. A number of letters from the witness's family, friends, including her husband.
Okay. I'll get to you just as soon as the ranking member.
Mr. Chairman, I have 3 letters addressed to both you and the ranking member, and I'd ask that they be entered into the record.
Without objection.
And it's also my understanding that Mr. Judge is not willing to come forward to answer our questions. As a result, we cannot test his memory or make any assessment of his thoughtfulness or character. And I think that's why the failure to call him to testify is so very critical. And I hope the majority would reconsider that.
Senator Blumenthal.
Mr. Chairman, I ask if you have sworn statements that you're submitting for the record, that we have those individuals come before us so that we can ask them questions about those statements. I think that the nature of this proceeding would be compromised if we lack an opportunity to ask them questions about sworn statements that will be part of the record. So, frankly, Mr. Chairman, I would object to entering them in the record.
Mr. Chairman?
Okay. Senator Whitehouse.
I have a number of letters that I would like to ask submitted to the record that relate to the importance of proper investigation by trained professionals in pulling these kind of investigations together, from the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, the National Women's Law Center, the National Organization for Women, and so forth.
Without objection, order, Senator Kennedy.
Mr. Chairman, I have a question for our chairman. The statements that Senator Blumenthal talked about, those were statements taken by our majority staff.
They're already in the record.
Yes, sir, but those statements were taken by our majority staff?
Yes.
Did minority staff participate?
No.
Why not?
You'll have to ask them.
Well, were they instructed not to participate?
No.
They chose not to?
That's right.
If I may, Mr. Chairman,
and if I could, I still think I have the floor, Mr. Chairman.
Let's listen to Senator Feinstein.
Can we be excused?
I am
the witness is quite tired.
I'd like to, if you'd wait just a minute, I'd like to thank Dr. Ford.
All right.
In fact, we're going to continue this meeting, and we can, so let's just be nice to her. Dr. Ford, I can only speak as one of 21 senators here, but I thank you very much for your testimony, more importantly for your bravery coming out and trying to answer our questions as best you could remember. Thank you very much. We'll adjourn for 45 minutes, or not adjourn, recess for 45 minutes.
Okay, so there it is, 45-minute break called by Chairman Chuck Grassley now as we continue to watch the Kavanaugh hearings, which have been going since 10 o'clock this morning, are expected to go all day. You are watching CBS News continuing coverage of the Senate Judiciary Committee hearings, now in their 5th hour. College professor Christine Blasey Ford swore under oath that Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh sexually assaulted her when they were teenagers. The committee will hear from him later today. Joining me in our coverage are CBS This Morning co-host Gayle King and John Dickerson. Also, CBS News legal analyst Ricky Kleeman and Jen Crawford, who covers the Supreme Court. CBS This Morning co-host Norah O'Donnell is on Capitol Hill as well, and political correspondent Ed O'Keefe is just outside that hearing room. Ricky, to you first. What's changed in the last hour and a half?
I think that the last bit of examination by Rachel Miller, the hired prosecutor on Rachel Mitchell, excuse me, on behalf of the Republicans, was powerful in raising a possible doubt about the witness's testimony. If she had gotten to that a lot sooner, she could have developed it. And what she was really basically trying to say is that it's all about memory, and that if you perhaps had gone to a forensic examiner and done it the right way, that perhaps you would have remembered it correctly and a person would not have been Brett Kavanaugh. But that may have been way too little, way too late.
In other words, she was saying that if a proper forensic, the way she prefers to do it, Rachel Mitchell that is, after a trauma if it was done that way as opposed to the polygraph test? Possibly she could have remembered even more.
Well, she could have remembered even more. Perhaps she could have remembered it differently. The one thing it doesn't shake is this. You have a woman who says that she's 100% sure it was Brett Kavanaugh. Yeah. She knew Brett Kavanaugh. It's not like she picked a stranger out of a lineup of someone she had never met. So it's very, very difficult to be in the position of the prosecutor to try to undermine the credibility. So you're back to where Jan was, which was really, if you're not undermining credibility and showing that she's lying, or really that she's mistaken, I think lying is way off the table. She's not lying. That she's mistaken. That really, do you have another goal, which is the political goal that has to do with the timing, that may be something that would be used by the politicians after this.
But Ricky, help me understand, how are you supposed to remember something differently if you know the person who assaulted you?
Well, that's what I say.
Yeah, I don't understand what she's getting at.
What she's getting at is that sometimes we imprint a memory in a way that we remember the memory and not the fact. The problem is this, she knew him. Yeah.
Quickly to both of you, apologies, but John Cornyn is speaking right now. Let's listen, because we're just hearing from some of the senators for the first time.
Okay.
That wasn't conveyed to her. Obviously, this is a tough setting for any witness, but I thought it went as well as you could expect. It's essentially, I think, what we heard is an articulation of what we already saw in her letter.
Senator, you handle the vote counts around here. Based on what was said this morning by her, do you have any sense yet of whether you have what you need?
I think we need to hear from the judge. His reputation is on the line, his career as well. This needs to be a fair process to both Dr. Ford and to Judge Kavanaugh.
Did any of you have it? Did any of you have?
Did you personally find her to be credible?
I found no reason to find her not credible. There are obviously gaps in her story. Obviously, we know people who are traumatized can have those sort of gaps. But again, I regret that she finds herself in this circus-like setting, because her letter to Senator Feinstein was released to the press against her knowledge and without her authorization, and that she wasn't told by her lawyers that she could have been interviewed in a private setting by investigators on both sides and get her testimony that way. But I thought she did just fine.
Are you pleased with Rachel Mitchell's questioning
I think she did exactly what I hoped she would do, and that is, in a dignified and professional way, ask questions to get information. I would say most of the comments made by our friends across the aisle struck me as more political. They didn't really ask questions seeking information. We obviously are interested in getting to the truth here, and unfortunately, this is a hyper-politicized environment, no doubt about it.
Senator, it seemed towards the end.
Graham has a few
well,
things
Senator Graham, then I'll ask you. She seemed towards the end, Ms. Mitchell, to be questioning the political motives of Dr. Ford's attorneys by raising questions about how things were paid for and how she was put in touch with them.
I'm really upset that they knew about this in August and never told anybody. I'm really upset if Dianne Feinstein believed this was a credible allegation, that you wouldn't do Mr. Judge Kavanaugh the service of saying, I've got this, what's your side of the story? Turn it over to the committee so we could have something not this close to the midterms. When they say that she wasn't sure we were willing to go out there, that's a bunch of bull. I don't know what they told Ms. Ford, but we were willing to go to California. We were told she couldn't fly. All I can say is that we're 40-something days away from the election, and their goal, not Ms. Ford's goal, is to delay this, pass the midterms, so they can win the Senate and never allow Trump to fill the seat. I believe that now more than ever. I don't know who paid for a polygraph, but somebody did, and here's what I'm more convinced of. The friends on the other side set it up to be just the way it is. Senator, I feel ambushed as the majority. We're going to hear from Mr. Kavanaugh, Judge Kavanaugh, and I've been a judge, a prosecutor, and a defense attorney, and here's what I'll tell you. When it comes to where it happened, I still don't know. I don't know when it happened. She said she's 100% certain it did happen. I bet you Judge Kavanaugh will say, I'm 100% sure I didn't do it. The people named say they don't know what Ms. Ford's talking about. She can't tell us how she got home and how she got there. And that's the facts I'm left with. A nice lady who has come forward to tell a hard story that's uncorroborated, and this is enough. God help anybody else that gets nominated. Based on what I heard today, you could not get a search warrant or an arrest warrant because you don't know the location, you don't know the time, and you don't have any corroboration. As to Ms. Mitchell, that's what I hoped she would do. I heard a bunch of speeches from a bunch of politicians who have politicized this from day one, who've been lying in wait for a political purpose, not Ms. Ford, but certainly them, making a bunch of speeches, and Ms. Mitchell methodically went through the facts of what happened that day, leading up to that day, and how we find ourselves here. So from my point of view, I'm pleased with what I saw.
You still want to vote on Friday?
Senator, given what you laid out about your own background as a prosecutor, as a defense attorney, as a judge, did you sitting up there find Dr. Ford to be credible?
I didn't find her allegations to be corroborated against Mr. Kavanaugh. I don't doubt something happened to her, but she is saying it's Brett Kavanaugh, but she can't tell me the house, she can't tell me the city, she can't tell me the month of the year. He's saying I didn't do it. So here's what you do. When you have an emotional accusation and an emotional denial, use the rule of law. The presumption of innocence attaches to the person accused. You have to give them notice in times of time and location. You ask, is there anybody to verify this? And when you give names, all of them go the other way. Having said that, what I think about Ms. Ford, very competent, accomplished lady. Something happened, I don't know what, but you're asking me to say it was Brett Kavanaugh, and I don't know when it happened, where it happened. He said it didn't happen, but I would say this. I thought it was a good suggestion for her to go talk to somebody to work through this.
Do you still want to vote on Friday?
How is that not all an argument for a more fulsome investigation?
If you really believe we needed an investigation of this, why didn't you tell us in August?
But why not do
So
it now?
this is now listen. The FBI is going to tell us what? What house are they going to go to? What city are they going to go to? Who are they going to talk to? Because they can't tell us the month, barely the year. So this is all delay.
Could Mr. Judge tell you that? Could Mr. Judge tell you that?
So here's where they're going, Mr. Judge. He says, I didn't do it. I don't know what she's talking about. They want to bring him in, trash him out, and call 25 people. Well, they say that he's an abuser, and guess what? We'll be past the midterm. I'm not going to reward people for playing a political game. I think with her life, she is just as much a victim as this as I think Brett Kavanaugh, because somebody betrayed her trust. And we know who she gave the letter to. And the people that betrayed her trust, they owe her an apology.
Do you still want to vote on Friday? Yeah. You still want to vote on Friday?
Yeah.
All right. Jeff, I don't know if you can still, if you hear me. But obviously a juiced-up Senator Graham there, who clearly is upset about what transpired, believes there's holes in her argument. And he isn't the only Republican who said that. I spoke with another member of the committee earlier during one of the breaks who said privately, because he didn't want to sort of flash all his cards, that they are concerned about this hole about how is it she doesn't remember? She doesn't know how she got home that night. How is it that she was afraid to fly but somehow ends up here in Washington? Her team won't tell us how she got here, and then, of course, she points out during her testimony that she had flown a few times to the East Coast. So definitely holes in her argument, but Republicans agree. She came across as likable, she came across as credible, and they expect the judge to hopefully do that as well this afternoon.
All right, Ed, thanks very much. Great job with those questions, and thank you for speaking to both of them. So, Senator Lindsey Graham with the second and by far strongest reaction so far to what we saw this morning and early this afternoon. Senator Graham saying he felt ambushed and going after not Christine Blasey Ford, but the Democrats, and saying that this was politically motivated, the way it was orchestrated, the timing, all meant to delay the process so that it would be pushed past the midterms or potentially even far beyond that. So some fiery language there from Senator Lindsey Graham. He did not answer the question of whether he is still calling for a vote tomorrow, which would then potentially lead to a final vote and potentially confirmation of Judge Brett Kavanaugh early next week. if that were to happen. But we have yet to hear from Judge Kavanaugh. That's going to take place this afternoon after Christine Blasey Ford's testimony just wrapped up. We dealt with 3 sessions there where Democratic senators all had a chance to ask questions, and pretty much every Republican deferred to the special prosecutor, Rachel Mitchell, who took Christine Blasey Ford through a timeline of what she says happened back in the early 80s, and then also question what has happened here in just the past few months. Nora's on Capitol Hill. She's been watching this all morning and afternoon as well. And Nora, actually, do we have Dick Durbin right now we're looking at? Let's listen to that.
She was terrified, but I thought she handled the questions professionally and honestly, volunteered answers when she didn't have to. I thought she made a very credible presentation.
Do you think it backfired on the Republicans to have an outside counsel or staff counsel do the questioning instead of themselves?
Well, if you listen to the prosecutor's conclusion that doing an interview in 5-minute segments is not recommended, you can tell that she too was frustrated. I couldn't follow her line of thinking. I tried to understand where she was coming from. It seemed so oblique and so fragmented. I never quite understood what she was trying to say.
How would you Christine
The thing we need to hear the most is what is very obvious. If there is no evidence and there are no witnesses to back up what she just told us under oath, why aren't you supporting an investigation by the Federal Bureau of Investigation? Wouldn't you want to clear your name and make sure that the court didn't have a person, a justice, who came in under a shadow of suspicion?
Okay, Dick Durbin's reaction to what he has heard today. He talked a little bit about the prosecutor, Rachel Mitchell, who was picked by Republicans. And what was interesting to hear at the end there, at least, was that Rachel Mitchell, in the end of her questioning of Christine Blasey Ford, the prosecutor picked by Republicans was essentially undercutting the strategy then picked by Republicans and saying, there's not a lot I can do in 5-minute segments when I'm then interrupted, and there's not a whole lot of places to go. As she finished up her questioning of Christine Blasey Ford this morning, Ricky, you've talked about that a lot as well, and the challenge that she faced in trying to get information here.
I don't envy her position, and she had two duties. One was to try to undermine the credibility of Dr. Ford in one way or another, whether it was to her memory or to, in fact, whether or not she was telling the truth. And the second one was to carry out the political agenda of the Republicans who hired her, which clearly she did much of her examination dealing with the timing of the letters, the conversations with the representative and then with Senator Feinstein, and then her getting a lawyer and then the polygraph. And so what she is trying to do is give the Republicans cover for those who really would like to say this is all a Democratic problem.
Did she do that? Did she do that? It was interesting to hear Senator Durbin say, I had a hard time following her line of questioning.
Well,
following Rachel Mitchell.
Yes, it was very difficult to follow Rachel Mitchell because of the 5-minute intervals. I mean, we saw it in the very first segment when she was trying to deal with 3 issues that needed editing in a document or corrections in a document. She couldn't even get to the third one.
Yeah.
But I think when you think about kind of watching what Senator Graham had to say in his reaction to that, I think is a way of thinking about how she did conduct these questions, because she did raise and point to some real holes in the testimony that we haven't seen before. She raised inconsistencies about the specific year. Remember, it started out being sometime in the 80s, and then it was the early 80s, and then it became maybe 1982, 1983, and now all of a sudden it's 1982. So,
but they say that's common, though, with trauma victims. You
Especially
may not remember the year, but you certainly remember.
But this started out in her starting out from her testimony today, but then going back to even what she told the Washington Post. So that wasn't that long ago. So they were able to point to she was able to point to some inconsistencies in her story that she's even told recently. And how many people were at the party? The Washington Post reported this, but then she said this to the therapist, and then she said this now. All of that, all of those inconsistencies that may not add up to much, and there was no real aha moment, but all of that then allows what we saw and the reaction from what you're going to see from Republicans, which is the facts. After this hearing, there is still no corroboration. There is still no contemporaneous evidence. It is still credibility, as Nora's been talking about. It was he said, she said. This is a question of credibility. People believe that she came across as credible, but now it's all on Judge Kavanaugh.
In other words, there's room on both sides to make the argument that we support this person or we support this person or this is why we're voting.
But for the small number of people who have to make the ultimate decision here, who are on the fence, they have to decide, was Dr. Ford credible enough not to elevate Kavanaugh? It's the question of whether she was or wasn't credible, and if she was not credible enough and he deserves to be elevated to the Supreme Court, what was it about her that was not credible? That has to be weighed against what was witnessed today, which even the Republican senators were saying she seemed credible. I was struck that Senator Cornyn said that the gaps were proof of the trauma. I mean, in other words, saying he saw some gaps in her story, but then he quickly said right after that, that's proof of the trauma, as if to it wasn't his intent, but to
underscore
this and explain this.
I can't imagine anyone watching that saying that she was evasive in any way.
No,
she answered the questions that were asked. Now, as we move to the afternoon, Jan, the question is, what are we going to hear from Brett Kavanaugh?
Right, and I think, again, I mean, because now we really got no new information, no new facts. We saw some inconsistencies. It's now the pressure is on Kavanaugh to come across as credible and believable and answer these questions as openly and honestly and forthrightly, I should say, as he can. And so you're going to see him present a defense that this was not me. And I think that it's going to be a pretty impassioned one, because this is not about, we were talking earlier, just the Supreme Court and a seat on the Supreme Court for life. This is about his life and a reputation that he's built. And so you're going to see him make that opening statement, and then it's the questions.
But were there
the Democrats
inconsistencies enough, Jan, to doubt her story?
Well, what we're going to see from Kavanaugh, though, you will see the Democrats try to impugn that character, everything, that name, that integrity, that he's going to say, this is at odds with the way I've lived my whole life. So it's going to be his life open for examination this afternoon.
Nora O'Donnell standing by.
How combative do you expect that to be, Jen?
I think it could be quite combative, but Ricky has said earlier, and I agree with this, that based on the tone of the hearing so far and the way Republicans are interpreting it, like we're trying to be fair, we're being the grown-ups, Democrats are playing politics. If Democrats continue to look like they're really playing politics, that in some ways could actually help Kavanaugh and the Republicans who are going to try to make the argument for him.
You can't imagine Democrats want to do anything to make themselves the story after the testimony from Dr. Ford, who it seems there's agreement was a credible witness. I mean, that if purely political motives, they would want her to be the face of this, not themselves. But they might get in their own way.
So we hear, here's the other question, Ricky, that's, I think, worth asking. So Rachel Mitchell handled the questions for Republican senators for Christine Blasey Ford. How does she then play into the Kavanaugh questions?
Well, the Kavanaugh is her witness, assuming that she is, in fact, going to ask the questions for all of the Republican senators. And so there is a part of Rachel Mitchell that you could watch when she would attempt to be friendly and comforting and be there with you and act almost as if she were the advocate for Dr. Ford to make her feel secure. Well, that's exactly what she has to do with Brett Kavanaugh. She has to be his partner in this. And Brett Kavanaugh has got to show his humanity. We're used to looking at someone's confirmation hearing of whether or not they have the fitness to be in a life-tenured appointment to the United States Supreme Court, which is making the law, interpreting the law for the entire country, which could for him be 30, 40 years. So is he fit? So she has to show him to be fit. And it's a contradiction, because you have to be factual and you have to be calm. At the same time, your life and your family's life has been upended, and we need to see your pain.
And I think the challenge for Kavanaugh is, yes, he's a lawyer, and one of the senators made the point that, he's used to being up in the Senate, but he's not like a trial lawyer. He's not this polished guy. He's not someone who goes on television a lot. He has been very much, he's an intellectual. He's been a judge. He's cloistered away in that ivory tower. He's a law professor. So this is not a natural form for him by any means.
But it's a more natural form for him than it was for her, for sure.
Not necessarily.
I mean, he has gone through some hearings already, right?
But,
But never hearings in which...
Yeah, I mean,
not necessarily.
Understood.
You're also dealing with the fact that Brett Kavanaugh is going to have to face cross-examination from the Democrats.
And how do you think they should play this?
Well, I think that they need to be firm. And I think that they need to do what they are going to do, which is to go back particularly into that Fox News interview statements. It was so ill-advised because he made broad statements about the type of life that he led, which then allowed people from Yale to come forward and say he wasn't like that.
He probably didn't want to open. Nora O'Donnell is still standing by on the Hill. Nora?
Yeah, I've been talking to officials close to Kavanaugh because he's the person who's going to be testifying next, and I'm told that he is going to come back much more forcefully than he has in the past, calling this a grotesque and obvious character assassination. I'm told Judge Kavanaugh did watch most of this testimony, completely denies that he was at that house, that he sexually assaulted Dr. Ford. I think you got a sense from listening to Senator Lindsey Graham that Republicans are ready to wage war and really start to burrow into some of those what they believe are credibility gaps. Now, some people don't think those are credibility gaps. Republicans clearly do. They're going to bring up what they believe are 5 different accounts of how many different people were at that party. And as one official said to me, they're going to poke more holes in her credibility. On the same time, I have also spoken with a White House official who admitted that it was very compelling testimony that she gave there. I'm told that the president did watch most of Dr. Ford's testimony, not all of it because he was in New York for the UN meeting, so he missed about the first hour of it as he was coming and traveling, back down to Washington, but did watch some of that testimony. But I think we just to set up what we're about to watch is going to be incredibly compelling. Because as you all watched this morning along with me, Dr. Ford said that she is 100% sure that it was Brett Kavanaugh who sexually assaulted her, specifically describing the neurobiological reasons why she remembers that so clearly. You are now, according to people that I have spoken with, Judge Kavanaugh is going to call this character assassination, along with some of the other allegations that have been made. He believes that he is not only defending his credibility, but also his reputation and his character, which is what this has largely been about, credibility and character. Now, we heard Lindsey Graham, and I think you're going to see Lindsey Graham and some of the other Republican senators push back hard, but I think the 2 people really to watch for on the Republican side, for instance, are Senator Ben Sasse, a Republican from Nebraska, who, according to reports inside the room, was one of the few Republican senators who specifically went over to Dr. Ford, shook her hand, said thank you for being here, specifically addressed her in person. He has been critical of President Trump on a number of issues, so I would watch him very, very closely. The other person to watch is Senator Flake, who we know is a retiring Republican from Arizona, who has said it's very important to hear from her. And so watch very closely his questioning too, as well, to Judge Kavanaugh. Really, these questions about character in particular. The Democrats, I think you can expect they're going to be very, very tough on Judge Kavanaugh. And I think we're going to see a lot of fighting back and forth. This is an incredibly partisan committee. And as far as I'm told, as of last, the vote in this committee is still going forward tomorrow morning, no matter what.
It's going to be interesting.
Yeah, for sure, tonight and tomorrow. Jen, I'm curious, how in 1991, when Clarence Thomas testified and Anita Hill did as well, how did he prepare for that, and how did he establish the kind of tone that he wanted to set?
He sat down at his kitchen table with a notebook about like this. And wrote it all out by hand. And he said, he described to me, I talked to him about this in an interview I did with him about 10 years ago. Mm-hmm. It's still very raw. He said he couldn't sleep. He couldn't decide how to say it. He couldn't decide how to craft his statement. And he got up early in the morning, made a cup of coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and the words just came out. And all you've got to do is go back and look at that testimony. It is white-hot testimony. It is like fire. He did not do this. This is a travesty. His whole life, his reputation, everything that he had worked to build has been taken away from him by these senators. He talks about in the interview how he really felt it was an issue of race, which I think is obviously a very big distinction here. But when some of the senators were questioning, like Howell Heflin from Alabama, he felt like he was almost like being a plantation owner, talking down to him and putting him through this.
Lynching at the time, which is
high tech.
High-tech lynching, which is a very, very volatile word. But I'm curious, Ricky, is this the ultimate he said, she said? Now, she says she's 100% sure that it's him. He says not only is it not me, I wasn't even there.
Well, yes, it's a he said, she said. But
how do you determine who's telling the truth here?
How do we do it in a court of law? And here it's different because this isn't in a court of law. And after all, we're only looking ultimately for the final vote of a few senators, because we believe that the senators, no matter what, are going to vote along party lines with the exception of a few, though I could be surprised, I suppose. But whenever there are witnesses at trial who both seem to have an aura of credibility, and you have to make a choice, you have to decide what it is that makes you think that this one is telling the truth. In Dr. Ford's testimony, what we do know is that in addition to passing a polygraph, and yes, I know some people would call it junk science, but I'll tell you, in my own practice, when I used to have defendants who had been accused of sexual assault, and I would ask them if they would take a confidential polygraph for me, and not to worry that they're mostly inconclusive and not to fear anything about it. If they told me they wouldn't, that was all I had to hear. I didn't need to represent those people. If the ones, and probably about 80% of them, said that they would take it. So the polygraph does have value to me and may to other people. In addition, she has told other people about Brett Kavanaugh, although she's told them in more recent times. And the fact that she doesn't remember certain things and that it does change a bit here and there as to numbers and places, that ultimately that those kind of inconvenient truths, that makes her more credible to many people.
But this feels different too to me, because normally in many cases they'll say, well, he said, she said, consensual or not consensual.
Correct.
This is a case where he's saying, not only did I not do it though, Ricky, but I wasn't even there.
Right.
Well, that's the issue. You have such a stark divide here.
Yes, yes.
And that he hasn't given himself a lot of room in terms of the initial denials of what happened or didn't happen.
Well, he's not calling her a liar. He's saying that she has somehow been sexually assaulted by someone, or at least that's what he has said on Fox News, and that she has undergone a trauma, but it was not him.
Which is part of why, again, as you mentioned before, Rachel Mitchell didn't get into details of what happened inside that bedroom because of what he said before and what she anticipates. Right. I think that he'll say this afternoon as we move through this afternoon. Jen, what are the biggest questions you have about the next few hours?
How the Democrats are going to, well, first of all, we'll start because we'll hear from Kavanaugh first. So his statement, his demeanor, and certainly I would not expect him, for those of you who watched his interview, I think most people have seen at least excerpts of it on Fox News, where he was too measured, and he didn't have any indignation. There was no anger. I mean, he's been accused, and none of this came up yet, but some of the allegations that have been leveled against him have been pretty extraordinary, including gang rape and being at parties where multiple young high school girls were being raped over weekends in Bethesda, which, you know, on its face, you would expect if someone has been accused of that to go, are you kidding me? I mean, seriously? And so we didn't kind of see that in that Fox News interview. I would expect to see some of that anger and indignation when he's giving his opening statement. And then I would also want to be very curious to see how the Democrats not only go after him on his personal behavior and drinking, but whether they try to raise any of these other outside allegations. My guess is they won't. They want this to be, they don't want to hear about Michael Avenatti and these allegations. This is all about Ford, who they believe, based on what we've been hearing from the report, that did very well. So keep the focus on her.
The political question will be, who sets the terms of the debate after this is over? Does it become, do you believe Dr. Ford or not? And if that's the case, that's not great for Brett Kavanaugh. If it becomes, do you believe Brett Kavanaugh? And he gives the kind of strong defense of himself that Jan's talking about. What he needs to provide is a compelling defense of the person's vote, of a senator's vote. They need to be able to say, I elevated him because of X. And if they can say, because I found him credible, that helps those Republicans who are going to need to vote for him.
Does it ever become in any way, Ricky, I believe them both?
Well, you could believe in both in an odd way. You could believe that she believes she is telling the truth. She firmly believes she is telling the truth.
Which is why she could pass a lie detector.
Right, and that he firmly believes he is telling the truth. But then that leads you down another path, which is, what was his behavior like at this time in his life with other people? Was this just simply a night he doesn't remember? So that may not necessarily help him.
We're expecting to see Judge Kavanaugh here in just the next 2 or 3 minutes. But before we go back there and go to the camera that's going to show him, I want to go to Ed O'Keefe's camera. He has some more information from just outside that hearing room. Ed?
Hey, Jeff. Yes, I know you guys have been discussing Prosecutor Mitchell there and her role in all of this. It's going to change slightly once Judge Kavanaugh enters the room, I'm told, by a member of the committee. She's going to ask about 20 minutes worth of questions at the beginning, but we will eventually hear from at least some of the Republican members of the Judiciary Committee when they are called upon to question the judge. There's also been some questions asked about whether this was worth it. Was she an effective inquisitor? Was this the smartest move Republicans could make? I checked with some senior aides here who work for Republicans, and in the words of one of them, what was the alternative? Remember, the optics of 11 men quizzing this woman was such that they were so concerned about it, they went out and found Rachel Mitchell to come do this. But they say, look, ultimately she was trying to establish a fact pattern, and she did that to the best of her ability. Behind us here, just down the hall, is where Judge Kavanaugh is actually currently waiting. And he will walk down the hallway here back into into the hearing room, Dirksen 226, to sit down and begin his testimony. Here in Dirksen this afternoon, it's really just been cops and reporters. They're not really allowing any of the general public near this hearing room. That's mostly in deference to Dr. Ford and a hope that this would be a somewhat more discreet and respectful exchange. But as Jan and others have pointed out, we should expect that the Democrats, at least, will go after him pretty quickly. I suspect by the time we get to Senator Dick Durbin of Illinois, who is a more senior member of the Senate, but a partisan warrior nonetheless, and the second-ranking Democrat, that it's at that point the Democrats really will begin to dig into Kavanaugh, his personal life, and whether or not any of that speaks to his credibility. We asked some of the more junior Democrats on the committee earlier, are you going to do that? And why would you go into his sex life? Why would you bring up his drinking? And they said, look, it all speaks to his credibility, which is now in question as this exchange continues.
Well, that Democratic questioning is going to be very interesting to watch. Will also be interesting to watch. Ed, to your point, you think there will be some Republican questioning. To what extent John, Jeff Flake, and Ben Sasse potentially speak, since they are members of the committee there, and potential swing votes on all of this.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And what we then learn from the questions that they ask, because in the questions they ask, they will be laying the predicate for what their final decision will be on this nomination. And they will be able to say, I asked these questions because I sought an answer to this thing, I got the answer I wanted, and that led me to this vote. For them, as politicians, this is a moment to begin a narrative to explain their vote one way or the other. And so if they do get a chance to question, and that's why there could have been some benefit to having Republicans ask the questions, because in asking the question, you can frame the shape of the debate. And this is a political debate, as we've all been saying, it's not a courtroom. And the ability to frame and shape the question can sometimes determine what the politics end up being in the end.
You know, we're not inside a courtroom, we're not inside a government building, we're inside the court of public opinion here.
Which is also why, in certain ways, I understand that the optics were terrible to have 11 white men going after Dr. Ford, but at the same time, there was an ability also, if they had, to be able to have treated her with dignity in the way that Senator Grassley did in his opening statement, and they might have fared better for that.
Do you think that you said in the beginning, Ricky, that it was very hard for Rachel Mitchell to get a real dialogue going? Do you think she was effective despite the handicap that she had?
I don't think that she was effective, but I also don't think it's necessarily her fault.
The question was whether anyone could have been effective under those terms.
Right.
Precisely, and back to Jan's point, whether she was or wasn't effective won't be the thing that helps Brett Kavanaugh. What will be what helps him is whether he comes and Republican senators are able to say, I found him credible.
Right.
And I cannot. I just cannot believe there's a Republican on that committee that is thinking, dang it, I wished I'd had my chance to sit down and ask her all these questions. I could have really cross-examined her. I could have put her on the fire. No one would. That was fraught with peril.
It was.
And in this, particularly in this climate, you know, what they were able to do in 1991, you know, when Arlen Specter was really giving it, you know, to Anita Hill, is not what they're doing in 2018. And this may not have been a great morning for Brett Kavanaugh. And there wasn't the kind of cross that people had hoped for. But for the Republicans, I would be stunned if any of them thought, I wish I could have done that. I could have really put it to her.
Well, and they could have also had the opportunity that you said, Ricky, to show some grace, to show some compassion, and still make their points.
But then they have
done that.
But they have the constituents who are saying, and there are a lot of people who believe him,
right.
and they think he's been unfairly accused. He's this wonderful man, and look what Democrats are doing to him. Those are their constituents. So.
And that's a really great point. Those constituents would say, wait a minute, if they took the soft route, why didn't you really go after her?
And you messed up. It's your fault that, you know, you didn't defend this fine man enough. So it's not
That's a great point.
Right. Well, and you also have now the ability of whichever Republicans are going to use their own time, in addition to dealing with Flake and Sass, is they, of course, have the ability to do exactly what the Democrats have just done with Dr. Ford, which is to build up the person that Brett Kavanaugh is and his credibility, which was something that the Democrats did very well with Dr. Ford.
Regardless, we're expecting here this afternoon a dramatically different tone from what we saw this morning. And that's basically the tale of 2 days, presumably this afternoon. And as we wait for Brett Kavanaugh to walk in to that Senate hearing room, we will get an opening statement from Brett Kavanaugh as well. They've said they've given an unlimited time. He's released what he's going to say already, as did Christine Blasey Ford in the meantime. And then we will have the same questioning, if not the same tone, the same times for questioning from Democratic senators and Republican senators on the Senate Judiciary Committee, and that is 5 minutes apiece. However much Republicans then yield their time to the prosecutor, Rachel Mitchell. The guidance from Ed O'Keefe, who's just outside the hearing room there, is that they'll give Rachel Mitchell about 20 minutes to question. So is that the right way to think about it, Ricky, that Rachel Mitchell will be questioning Brett Kavanaugh?
Yes, she's going to question him, but you're still back to this crazy 5 minutes, 5 minutes, 5 minutes, 5 minutes. At least I assume you are, because it goes every other one. Yeah. So, no, she's not interrogating. She's propping him up.
But, you know, she could, depending on what her role is, she could, in an odd way, play the role that the Democrats were playing this morning, so that when, there's aggressive questioning or gentle questioning, the Democrats were able to step in and rehabilitate or vouch for as character witnesses. She could play that role. I don't know.
Possible. But also you have this. It's the whole question of timing. It's just like in a court of law when I'm on a roll and somebody interrupts me with an objection and it, would throw me, or at least I couldn't get back so quickly on that roll. So here, she may be in a position, Rachel Mitchell, to be able to interrupt the Democrats' flow. If the Democrats have any continuity, if they've thought about how they're going to build upon each other, they may not. They may be all in their insular little worlds.
And also give him a way of almost like playing cleanup. Like if something's going, she could say, but wait, now don't you mean this? And you have a witness that said that, and so it's whatever pressure points are.
And she's experienced at that because prosecutors do a lot of redirect examinations.
As a political matter, it seemed to me the Democratic game plan was really easy to identify. clarify. They praised Ford for being heroic, and they made a lot of the FBI investigation not taking place. In an effort to say, you may find gaps in her story, they could have been solved by an FBI investigation. Each of them kind of stayed on those 2 points throughout their 5-minute allotted time. It'll be interesting to see what Republicans, when we're all through with the Republican questioning of Kavanaugh, what the two things we could come down to. Because at the end of the day, when this is debated, it's basically you got about 2 points you can make in the political debate that's going to take place around this. And then what will that be for Republicans?
Is there any doubt in your mind that the vote will happen tomorrow? It was interesting when he was asked the question twice. Well, he clearly ignored the question.
Lindsey Graham, you're talking about.
Yes. Can he still be on track to actually vote tomorrow?
Yes.
I mean, that's where they haven't said anything otherwise at this point. We are just learning now that Brett Kavanaugh's family is inside the hearing room now as we wait for him to arrive in the second dramatic part of this historic day on Capitol Hill, as we've already heard from Christine Blasey Ford, Brett Kavanaugh's accuser, and now we wait to hear from Kavanaugh himself. Ricky, if you're a senator on either side right now, or if you're one of these Republican senators, let's say, first, who wants to ask a question and not yield that time to Rachel Mitchell, what are you asking?
Well, I think you're asking questions about his character. You're asking him about how he's lived his life, or you're asking him about the trauma that he and his family have been put through and what has happened to his reputation, which, for all intents and purposes, seems to have been very, very good in the court, the powerful court on which he served, and that you want to remind people of that, and that Dr. Ford is not the only one who suffered, that the Kavanaughs are suffering.
And if I could, this reminds me, there was a moment in the hearing for Justice Sam Alito, who was replacing a key swing vote as well. And it turned the entire hearing when he got friendly questioning from Lindsey Graham about how and Lindsey Graham was saying, you're not a bad person. You've never had allegations like this against you. And Justice Alito said no. And his wife started crying and ran out of the room. And at that moment, the hearing room completely changed, and Sam Alito was headed for the Supreme Court. So that will be something, that kind of moment, too.
And having his family there, I do think, is very important. I think that what has happened to him in the public eye has also happened to his family. And that, I think that the senators, we don't know about the camera, but the senators are also going to be aware of how Mrs. Kavanaugh reacts during this hearing.
Well, you made this point, Jen. This is no longer just a job interview.
Right.
That's right. And Republicans will want to reframe it from being a job interview to get a promotion into, if you don't vote for Judge Kavanaugh, it will be a permanent verdict on his character, for his life, and for the life of his family and children. And that's what you're choosing to do if you don't choose to elevate him, raising the emotional stakes for Republican senators.
And that's where you're going to hear with no corroboration, no contemporaneous evidence, multiple inconsistencies in the story that we heard. And this is all cooked up by Democrats because they sat on the allegation for 2 months.
But they said on the allegation at her request, though. Does that matter?
Well, what they were going to say, and what I think we're already starting to hear, is that they could have brought this forward, even had her name redacted, done it anonymously, so that it didn't have to even become public, and that Senator Feinstein and then the Representative Anna Eshoo could have come forward with that. So that's going to be part of their narrative, but we're already seeing them come out to say this.
Well, Dr. Ford has certainly made it clear throughout the morning that she never wanted this to be a public thing, that she came because this was her civic duty.
And she hoped he wouldn't get the nomination. She wanted it to be someone else entirely. That's why she came out when she did.
And she came out early enough before it made it to the short list. And she did it in a way that she didn't go to the media, that she did the civic thing about going. It's like what you learn as a little kid, that when you see something that's not working in your town, call your local congressman. And that's exactly what she did.
And the tip line.
And the encrypted tip line, where she really could remain with this feeling of safety, of confidentiality. I think Brett Kavanaugh is in a position here. I'm with Jan. I don't know if I were Brett Kavanaugh that I would have watched any of that because I think that it would either infuriate me if I say I wasn't there, I didn't do this, this never happened, and it is an assassination on my character, or it might throw me off in terms of my emotional balance when I go in there.
I still think you have to know, Ricky, what the other person's saying about you.
Well, I think we knew what she was saying.
Yeah, but I would want to hear it.
And he'll likely be asked that, right?
Yes.
Of course.
Whether he was watching this?
Of course. And it's a better
reaction was.
It's a better answer for him to say he watched, and whatever his reaction may have been. It's a better answer than saying, no, I wasn't going to do this.
There's no compromise here. He's elevated. He's elevated to the Supreme Court, or he's not.
Right. And he will have the tag with him for the rest of his life, elevated or not.
And there are no winners here. Whether he's elevated or not, he doesn't win. She doesn't win. The Supreme Court.
The families don't win.
It's this entire process. There are no winners.
So what could have made this a winning situation? Would the FBI investigation in the beginning have at least made this seem like a fair situation to people who were calling for it from the beginning? I said earlier today, she wanted an FBI investigation, and people that have something to hide are not saying, please come and investigate.
Well, the thing, when the committee became aware of the allegations only a couple weeks ago, there could have been then an FBI investigation where they went and interviewed the witnesses. The argument against that was that the Senate has the same kind of all these statements that they're taking with their investigators. It's in the Senate now. That's the forum for it. Those are punishable as a felony if you lie. So it's really no different. We're going to do it in the committee because the FBI investigation process has already ended and this had never come up by then.
But I think Senator Graham said we could have had an investigation within the last 11 days.
No question about it.
That's exactly right. Absolutely. That's what I'm saying. They could have done that in the Hill-Thomas when they reopened that. It's a matter of 3 days that it took them. So, but that wouldn't have answered anything. Is my point. They don't resolve. The FBI just takes interviews, and so it's not.
It would have been an objective investigation in the public's eye. That you would have had
maybe it would have robbed a talking point that the FBI. Politically, maybe that was a big blunder by Republicans. Whether or not it would have provided any more information.
And perhaps there's some chance that they might have found something that would have made things clearer. But
it might have cleared him.
Well, indeed, and some people have argued that there should be an FBI investigation for the purposes of clearing him. But I think embedded in your question, Gail, which is could this have been better? Largely embedded in this is that this is really not the best venue to adjudicate the trickiest, thorniest questions in the culture that are bedeviling all parts of the culture. Exactly. And so it is inevitably fraught, and this is not really the best place to unwind those questions because we've yet to find a best place for that yet in our culture.
How much we've learned that we did it in 1991 and now doing it all over again in the same way. And John, to your point, that it not necessarily being the most effective way to do it, but this is how it's happening. Right now. We see Senate Judiciary Chairman, Republican Chairman Chuck Grassley heading back in. Lindsey Graham heading back in. He says he feels ambushed by the process. Orrin Hatch, you see there. So senators making their way back in. There's your Republican picked questioner, Rachel Mitchell, also on her way back in. John Kennedy to the hearing room right now. John Cornyn, who we heard from before, and his words, John Cornyn's words were, I would say, more measured than Lindsey Graham's were immediately after him. Lindsey Graham certainly had some very strong opinions about what has taken place so far. You see Ted Cruz walking back in, Ben Sass. So all senators, Jeff Flake. Again, and you just saw a few of the senators who you're going to be watching very closely, not just this afternoon, but in the next few days, as we figure out whether this first vote, what happens this afternoon, B, whether a vote takes place tomorrow, and then C, whether one takes place after that early next week regarding Brett Kavanaugh and the Supreme Court. They took a break now. It was about 50 minutes ago, and they said it was going to be a 45-minute break in between when Christine Blasey Ford testified and when Judge Brett Kavanaugh testified. So it's now been a little more than that 45 minutes. We've been asking the question of whether Judge Kavanaugh had been watching some of this testimony. We don't know the answer to that. We do know that during part of this time, he was obviously making his way from his home to the hearing itself. We are also told that the president has been watching this hearing. He also was in transit heading to D.C. from New York, where he was for the UN meetings. So the folks involved intimately in this, as well as the rest of the country, watching everything that has been happening here so closely today, and will continue to watch this afternoon, as we just don't know at this point. Ricky, what's going to happen this afternoon?
No, we don't. I mean, we can anticipate as much as we can that you're going to see an indignant Brett Kavanaugh, but you're going to also see a passionate one.
Let's listen and watch as Brett Kavanaugh walks in.
He's holding his hand, her hand, right?
Yes, he was holding his wife's hand. Yeah.
They had the camera on.
I would hope so.
Judge Kavanaugh walking into that hearing room, holding hands with his wife, a blue tie, as he makes his way to the hearing table. Just his name in front of him. Christine Blasey Ford was flanked by her attorneys. I don't see other seats there right now, so it's just Brett Kavanaugh by himself.